Hey guys, and welcome back to a second video in the series of performance and cognition. And I'm Thomas Chang. I'm a nuclear scientist and national level athlete, and I wanted to share a few words on research that I've done over the past 2 years, particularly been interested in cognitive enhancement, not only for work performance but also sports performance. So this is probably going to be quite a long video. Feel free to move around. I'll put some timestamps in the video that you can move to the right area. But let's get into it. I think the first part is for a broad view of what we should know. Which levers actually make the biggest difference. And the thing to note here is that we are focusing on the levers that stop a loss rather than ones that necessarily make a gain. So as we know, neuroscience is a very complicated field. Even neuroscientists themselves don't really understand the brain fully, and we are years and years away from the human brain being fully mapped. It's by far the most complex thing in science. But we know from the outcomes from the scientific studies and meta-analysis in this presentation and in this video what actually makes a difference. And I have tried all of these things, and I know what works for me, and also what works for you might be slightly different, but these are the things which have been proven. So in terms of statistics, the things that we're going to present today have actually been statistically significant in meta-analysis, so that there's been multiple studies. It's not just one study, although there is a lot of disinformation out there in terms of supplements. Methylene blue comes for an example. The biggest levers are quite boring. So sleep, that's where memory consolidation happens, and there is a massive difference in someone who only manages to get 6 hours sleep versus someone who prioritizes the sleep, and the sleep quality, not just the length. Other big levers that we are in control of: aerobic fitness. Spending 40 minutes a day in that zone 2 area really makes a difference on our working memory and hippocampal volume, and actually changes the structure of our brains, which is quite interesting. So let's just get into it as we go along. These 8 levers, I will say for everyone watching the video, try and experiment a little bit every day. Don't do everything all at once necessarily, and focus on the levers which have the biggest impact. So sleep is by far the most important lever. It sounds very boring, but there's been some interesting things that have happened in studies. So I think there was a study of a student in 1964 that he avoided sleep for almost 11 days, and when the researchers asked him to count backwards in multiples of 7, he stopped halfway. And then they asked him, why did he do that? And it's not that he necessarily couldn't do it, he just forgot what task he was doing. So in terms of the working memory, sleep is by far the biggest term in the equation. And I think the important thing to note is that we can optimize it, we can improve it. There's several things we can do. And what actually pays off: fixing the wake time, fixing our circadian rhythm. And obviously, life is difficult. Sometimes we get challenged. We have to wake up at a certain time for our jobs, etc. But we all have different sleep chronotypes, and a lot of the self-help books out there that tell you to wake up early, rise and grind, all that stuff, that's not necessarily going to work for everyone. The main thing is regularity. So if you are a night owl, you go to sleep at midnight. Wake up at 8, get into work a bit later on. That's important for everyone. You cannot change that necessarily. It's better that you get the time in, you get the regularity. Your sleeping environment 100% needs to be optimized. You need to reduce the light. And crucially, after you wake up, expose yourself to daylight. So yeah, I think it's go outside, expose yourself to daylight just from waking up, and that really helps the wakeful and the circadian rhythm. In terms of falling asleep, yeah, sleep onset, as we say here, it requires a 1 degree drop in core temperature. So make sure that your environment, as much as possible, is cool. Open a window, make sure you have the right ventilation. That's crucial. If you have all of your windows closed, CO2 building up through the night, your sleep quality will drop. There's certain tactics you can do to try and drop your core temperature before bed to make sure that you can fall asleep quickly and efficiently. Taking a warm shower before the bed. There's also some more expensive tools and equipment that you can buy. Obviously the popular one being 8 Sleep or similar mattress toppers, which help you reduce the temperature of your actual bed. It's cooled. It's a cooled device that really helps regulate your sleep. I think this is a bit overpriced, but do what you need to do to improve your sleep quality. And the most important thing is obviously get rid of alcohol, get rid of caffeine, at least in the few hours before your bed, and you will sleep better. So lever 2, aerobic fitness. So this is something that I personally, as a powerlifter, have avoided. At the moment, I have been doing the last few months more cardiovascular exercise, and it's definitely made a difference on how I can think. And also, the interesting thing here is that it is a lever which helps the brain receive more oxygen, more blood flow. So it's incredibly important that everyone does some aerobic fitness. You can see here, there's really a substantial effect. Okay, G is the standardized mean difference on a test, a control subject versus a person who was studied over this time. So there is some difference here, and it actually does change the brain structure. So this is, when we say zone 2, that means 60 to 70% of your heart rate. You don't need to go balls to the wall and do marathons, 10-kilometer run, all that. Just 3 times a week, 40 to 50 minutes fitness, moderate intensity. And I think here is also written, your VO2 max makes a difference. The efficiency, your brain is consuming a lot of energy and blood flow. To improve the efficiency on that, it makes sense that we need to do some cardiovascular exercise. So that's what we can say about that. Lever 3, strength work. So I think a lot of people, maybe they either work only on strength or only on cardiovascular fitness, thinking that one will replace the other. It's very surprising, actually, that from a cognition point of view, strength and metabolic control is really important. Muscle is the main glucose sink in the body, and glycaemic exposure is corrosive on hippocampal tissue. So this is, again, removing a loss, stopping a loss, rather than necessarily boosting the brain. This is the thing. All of these levers, most of them, we need to make sure we are at that baseline where we can build on, and then the techniques that we use to learn reinforce information, like learning a new language, learning a new concept at work. That's the technique wise. We need to do everything we can to remove the things that might be holding us back. So this also has an interconnection with our sleep. I think a lot of people will realize if they work hard in the gym, they do some strength work, they do some cardiovascular, they sleep better. As you can see in the slide, the knock-on effect of heavy loading reduces the slow wave sleep pressure. This improves sleep. It's, again, something which Yeah, there is some, the mechanisms here are not fully understood, but we know that it works. So yeah, this is something maybe that costs time, compared to the sleep aspect. Yeah, that also costs time, but it's something maybe that takes a bit more effort. But yeah, doing heavy compound movements, doing some cardiovascular exercise in zone 2, this really makes a difference. This is statistically proven, and all of the sources are listed on the slide. Okay, moving on to lever 4, nutrition. And this is a story of substrate stability and vasculature. So nutrition, it's all about neurotransmitter synthesis, making sure that when we learn, we have the right, building blocks really there to make sure that our brain is developing. And, as we know, neuroplasticity is something which does take energy. It takes, building blocks, amino acids. So especially for vegetarians, I think if you have a deficit in your diet, you have a deficit of certain amino acids, taking certain supplements really helps. The highest ROI, so the bottom right corner, we can see here, highest ROI in changing your diet is reducing your alcohol to 0. Then just make sure that your protein and total energy is, at the right level. I think all of these blogs stating that if you take certain, whole foods, that's all very well and good, but it doesn't make that much of a difference. The proven stuff here is we have enough calories, we eat good quality food, and we don't drink alcohol. Okay, so lever 5, this is one which is maybe a bit more controversial, and a lot of self-help and gurus and YouTube videos will focus on this a lot. It has some evidence. There has been a lot of evidence, especially for creatine, for example, the performance and the boost to your working memory that it provides, especially on those that are sleep deprived. But this in itself doesn't actually help. Maybe it doesn't help too much. So these kind of changes really impact, for example, your sleep quality. If you find that taking melatonin, taking, certain supplements in here like magnesium glycinate, for example, magnesium L-threonate, if you feel like those and you see in your body that they make a difference on your sleep quality, then it pays off. But yeah, this is on the lower tier of levers on and how they affect our working memory and performance. We know that caffeine is a double-edged sword. We know that caffeine, if we take it, it boosts our neural activity. That's 100%. But it does come with a crash unless you, in my experience, use L-theanine to really smooth out that crash. I think the other things that really helps me, magnesium L-threonate, it does, for me, boost performance. Does it boost for everyone? Maybe not. I think it's something that you need to try for yourself. Not going to go too much into creatine right now, and I think on further videos explain more about supplementation, their mechanisms, and this is quite complex and really, sure, I think this won't hurt if you take magnesium L-threonate. So just very quickly, magnesium L-threonate is a specially synthesized form of magnesium that can cross the blood-brain barrier. It's the only form of magnesium that does that. So that is a clear mechanistic viewpoint why magnesium L-threonate really boosts cognition. It's essentially just adding something extra, or stopping a loss. Stopping giving your brain the minimum it needs to build and grow. It is very expensive. That's one of the downsides. Try to make it work. If try different forms of magnesium. Magnesium L-threonate is a very powerful form. It has been proven. It's something which is fairly recently invented or synthesized by biologists in California, I believe. But yeah, I think the only thing here is that it has only been really replicated or verified as a performance enhancer by the commercial developer of the compound. So okay, there's some bias there. We need to take everything with a pinch of salt here. Okay, so then this is a little bit why, okay, levers cannot necessarily be scored independently because they are all interlinked. All of these, changes that we can make are interlinked. Resistance training helps with the sleep. Taking the magnesium or reducing the alcohol also helps with the sleep. That's a lot of it. That's a lot of where our mental performance comes from, increasing our sleep quality and consolidation. That the sleep then has a knock-on impact to how we can structure our learning. Our encoding techniques, our attention architecture, it's all linked together. Then I just work on, so now lever 6, the environment. The most neglected lever is the air in the room. That is a fact. So the ancients, as far back as Confucius, or if we look into Taoism, they all knew that when we breathe properly, we breathe through our nose, we breathe in the right timing, and we breathe clean air, we can think clearly. So again, this is something which doesn't come into the picture for a lot of people. They just accept the air that they breathe. Especially, for me, I used to live in Germany in a big city, and I turned on, I bought an air purifier for my office, and I was horrified to see that it was in dangerous levels. So I was breathing in dangerous amounts of particulates, and the CO2 was also not very good. So really, we need to ventilate our room. We need to monitor the quality of our air, and especially if we live in an area with dirty air. And you can look that up on a website called IQ Air. And we can really see what is the problem there. We want to, again, this is about stopping a loss. This is a lever that's stopping a loss. We need to make sure that we're breathing, the right level of oxygen. We're not accumulating CO2 in our room. You need to go outside. At the end of the day, a lot of bad air quality is inside buildings. That's the surprising thing. You would think that the air inside a building is fine, especially if you have AC or something. But no, the air quality is normally better outside. And if it isn't, you really need to invest in commercial grade air purifiers. That's my opinion. At least monitor the situation. Buy a CO2 monitor, which is fairly cheap, and just keep an eye on it. Okay, so the next two levers are specifically about learning, about improving our working memory. So attention architecture. The way I like to think about this is, say that we have a 4-hour block, or a 4-hour afternoon planned. So we want to do some work, and it takes 20 minutes for us to ramp up in terms of getting into a deep task. Say we want to write a paper, a scientific paper or something like that. It takes 20 minutes even to get into the task and really focus. Then we get a message on Teams, or a notification or a call, interrupts us, pulls us out of that deep working, and then it takes another 20 minutes to get back into it. So we've wasted 40 minutes almost to return to the task. And this happens another 5-6 times in the 4 hours, and we've wasted so much time, and we've only done about 60 or 90 minutes of actual real work. So we cannot really do much about this other than removing the switching. So removing the distractions, blocking off our time. So I think a reasonable time to do deep work is about 90 minutes, and 2 blocks of 90 minutes is normally sufficient for everything that that we can do, or in terms of deep thinking, that's really the most we can do in one day. Most people. So focus on that. Make sure that you're not going to get interrupted. And yeah, that's something that's been proven through studies, meta-analysis. Okay, and then finally, encoding technique. So how do we actually learn? This also helps. I mean, I think for people that are students, they, like to highlight through their textbooks, read the stuff, read it again. This stuff is helpful, but will not actually encode the knowledge into and allow us to retrieve it later on. So depending on when we need it, we need to practice retrieval. So read it once, close the book, try to reconstruct it just from one reading. That struggling will make us, our brain fills in the blanks, tries to work it out for ourselves maybe. Then we help understand the actual information instead of just remembering and briefly it goes in one ear and out the other. Then depending on when we need the information, say if we want to make a presentation in 2 weeks' time, then we strategically place retrieval sessions, for example, in day 2 and day 7, so that reinforces that information. There's a lot also here about learning your learning style. So getting to know yourself, getting to know whether you learn better from audio, from visual, making diagrams. Try everything. Try a mixture of all and see what works. Okay, so and then just to, I would say, debunk some of the things. So these may be things which are often promoted as ways to improve your mind, which have, from the sources which I've looked at, negligible impact. So commercial brain training, ginkgo biloba, these kind of things, you can read this for yourself, but this is unevidenced. It's not really moving the needle compared to the other levers. So focus on the 8 levers, particularly sleep, doing physical training, supplementation. Yeah, we can make a few changes there and see what works, but these are the things which make very little difference. And then here is just a synthesis of everything we've been talking about. What would it look like to really optimize your day? Okay, this is maybe not 100% realistic to people, but if we can just take one thing away from this and improve our schedule and improve our habits, we're moving in the right direction. We're being mindful of it. So in conclusion, as we said, so here is D, so D and G, so they are really the standardized mean differences of the control group to the ones who had optimized each lever. So we can see that by far and away, sleep adequacy, regularity, and timing is by far the biggest impact on our working memory, on our reasoning, cognitive performance in general. That has a very high confidence to work, and that's something that we need to start looking at. Invest in that. Make sure that you do everything you can to improve it. Retrieval practice and space review, that's actually very high up there. So the way that we learn, if we're just doing surface level learning, listening to a podcast, not retrieving it, chances are that we won't remember it unless we have some kind of photographic memory or, elite level memory. Most people will need to retrieve that information and use it multiple times to be able for it to be able to sink in, fully understanding the material. I remember a senior engineering leader told me, when you make a presentation, understand the material and you'll never forget it. So understand it, make sure the concepts are fully understood, and repeat it strategically. As we said, lever 7 also, attention architecture, removing interruptions and task switching, because we know that as humans we can't focus on multiple tasks, and it takes us, depending on the depth of the task, it scales. So I said around 20 minutes to go into the peak peak performance, peak level of concentration on a deep task, that scales with the depth and complexity of the task. So that has a very high return on investment. Removing detractors, so removing alcohol, making sure that we consume caffeine carefully and preferably with L-theanine, that helps. And then I think the main thing is also making sure our air quality is good. If you're not lucky enough to live in the Nordics like myself, then there are things that you can do, things you can buy, which are high return on investment. Make sure, for example, if you have a separate office or where you spend your most of your time is well ventilated and has preferably a very good air filter. And then some of the lesser levers and supplements that we can take, magnesium, those things should be less prioritized, but why not? Try those, see how they work. There's actually quite a clear pattern. Actually, most of these things we can do are free, and more behavioral changes, which really, some of these will genuinely change the structure of our brains, and really, if we stay disciplined, they'll help us perform better at work, and that transfers into the whole of our life. Our mood, our performance in sports, all of these things are, for a happy and healthy and well and good wellness, these things are foundational, really. That's all I have to say. Thanks for watching the video and listening to the video. I will probably make a more deep dive into some of these things a bit later on. I know this has been quite a surface level presentation. But I'll also move on to other topics. So thank you for watching, and please subscribe. Thanks.